The morning light filtered through Richmond Preparatory Academy's tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the polished floors. Flora Richardson moved through the hallways with practiced invisibility, her backpack heavy with advanced placement textbooks. At 15, she had learned to navigate these spaces carefully, excelling without threatening, participating without dominating, existing in the narrow corridor between excellence and acceptability. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Flora? A voice called behind her. She turned to see Maya Thompson, a ninth grader, struggling with an armload of books that cascaded to the floor. Flora knelt immediately, helping gather scattered papers and textbooks. "Thanks," Maya breathed. "I'm so clumsy today." "You're not clumsy," Flora said quietly. "You're carrying too much." Officer Brandon Mitchell's voice cut through the hallway chatter. "Keep moving. You have 2 minutes to get to class." Flora glanced up. Mitchell stood at the corridor's center, hands on his belt, eyes scanning students with predatory focus. She'd noticed the pattern over months, how his attention lingered on certain students, how his definition of disruptive seemed remarkably selective. She helped Maya stack her books properly and stood. Mitchell was closer now, his gaze fixed on them. "I said, move." His voice carried an edge that made Flora's stomach tighten. "Yes, sir." Flora nodded respectfully, but Maya was still gathering papers. "Now means now." Mitchell stepped forward. "We're going, officer. Just—" His hand shot out, grabbing her shoulder with startling force. "Don't talk back to me." "I wasn't—" The words died as he shoved her, hard. Flora's body slammed against the lockers, her head connecting with metal in a sound that echoed through the suddenly silent hallway. Pain exploded behind her eyes. She slid down the cold steel, blood trickling warm across her temple. The world tilted. Through blurred vision, she saw faces frozen in shock. Ethan Morris, mouth open in disbelief. Jordan Parker, phone raised, recording. Maya Thompson, crying. And Officer Mitchell, already pivoting his narrative. The student physically resisted my instructions and became aggressive. I used appropriate restraint. Flora touched her forehead. Her fingers came away red. The hallway spun, but one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. This was the moment everything changed. She remained silent, watching, learning how power justified itself. Principal Victoria Morgan arrived within minutes, heels clicking urgently. But her first action wasn't checking Flora's injury. It was dispersing witnesses. "Everyone to class immediately. Give me your phones." "But," Jordan started. "Now, Mr. Parker." Flora let them help her to the nurse's office, saying nothing, remembering everything. Through the door, she heard Principal Morgan on the phone. "A minor altercation, both parties share some responsibility. No, nothing serious." The institutional machinery had begun its work. Judge Thomas Richardson stood before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, presenting oral arguments in a case involving qualified immunity for law enforcement. The irony would strike him later. His clerk's face appeared in his peripheral vision, urgent and apologetic. The note read, "Flora injured at school. Call immediately." Thomas excused himself with judicial composure that masked sudden terror. In his chambers, the school secretary's carefully modulated voice delivered reassurances that felt like warnings. "Nothing serious, minor incident, perhaps you should come by." He drove too fast through Richmond streets, past gentrified neighborhoods where historic black churches stood beside artisanal coffee shops, where his family's success was supposed to represent progress. The school's parking lot felt surreal. This building where Flora excelled, where she had won academic competitions and debate tournaments, it had hurt her. Inside, Principal Morgan materialized with professional sympathy. "Judge Richardson, thank you for coming. We wanted to discuss this incident together." Flora sat in Morgan's office, ice pack pressed to her temple, blood stained her white collar. Thomas's carefully constructed judicial temperament cracked. "What happened?" He knelt before his daughter. Flora's eyes met his, and in that moment, Thomas saw something that terrified him more than the injury: resignation. She'd learned something today about how systems treat people who look like her. "Mr. Richardson," Officer Mitchell stepped forward, uniform crisp, voice confident. "Your daughter refused to comply with hallway procedures. When I attempted to enforce school policy, she became physically aggressive. I used minimal necessary force to maintain order." Thomas rose slowly. He'd heard this script before, in countless cases, countless complaints, the language of justification. "My daughter became aggressive?" His voice remained level through years of practice. "Students today lack respect for authority," Mitchell continued. "I'm sure you understand given your position." "My position," Thomas repeated quietly. "My position is that my 15-year-old daughter is bleeding in a school office, and I'd like to see the security footage." Principal Morgan's smile tightened. "Unfortunately, the hallway camera malfunctioned during that period. Technical difficulties." How convenient. "Judge Richardson, I understand you're upset. Do you?" The question hung in the air. "Dr. Richardson should be arriving soon. Until then, no one touches my daughter." Nicole Richardson arrived minutes later, transitioning instantly into clinical assessment mode. Her hands moved gently across Flora's head, checking pupil response, asking about dizziness, nausea, vision changes. "She needs a CT scan. These are concussion symptoms." "The school nurse cleared her," Morgan protested. Nicole's gaze could have frozen fire. "I'm a doctor. My daughter needs imaging. We're leaving." In the car, Flora finally spoke. "They're going to bury this." "Not if I have anything to say about it," Thomas replied. "Dad," Flora's voice carried a weariness beyond her years. "You know how this works. You've seen it 1,000 times." She was right, and that truth cut deeper than anything else. His lifetime of working within systems, believing justice could be achieved through proper channels, Flora had learned in one brutal moment what he'd spent a career trying to deny. The system protected itself first. That evening, Flora told them everything. How Mitchell targeted certain students, how complaints disappeared, how the machinery of denial operated with practiced efficiency. Thomas Richardson, federal appellate judge, looked at his daughter and made a decision. If the system wouldn't protect her, he'd dismantle it from the outside. When Jordan's call came, offering video evidence and witness testimony, Thomas felt something shift. Not hope, exactly. Something more dangerous. Determination. The Richardson home transformed into a war room. Jordan arrived at sunset, laptop bag heavy with more than electronics. It carried truth. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward immediately," Jordan said, hands shaking slightly. "I was scared they'd confiscate. You did exactly right," Flora interrupted. "Strategic patience." The video played on Thomas's laptop. Even prepared, watching his daughter slammed against lockers stole his breath. Nicole's clinical detachment cracked, tears sliding silently down her face. "Again," Thomas said. "I need to see it again." They watched 5 times. Mitchell's aggression was undeniable. Flora's lack of resistance crystal clear. The excessive force indefensible. "This isn't just assault," Thomas murmured. "This is a civil rights violation, federal jurisdiction." Nicole documented Flora's injuries with medical precision. Photographs, detailed notes about concussion symptoms the school nurse had ignored or minimized. Headaches, difficulty concentrating, sensitivity to light. Evidence. Thomas pulled Officer Mitchell's employment history. 3 schools in 6 years, 23 civilian complaints, all dismissed or buried. The pattern was damning. "Look at this," Jordan spread printouts across the dining table. "I've been documenting disciplinary disparities for my journalism project. Black students are 8 times more likely to be arrested at Richmond Prep than white students for identical behavior." 8 times, Nicole repeated, her community organizer mind already calculating implications. Flora studied the data. "We need to find other victims. This isn't about me anymore." Her parents exchanged glances. Their 15-year-old daughter understood what many adults never grasped. Individual justice meant nothing without systemic change.
Mitchell's employed by Secura Schools, Inc., not the district directly, private contractor. That complicates litigation but opens other avenues. Dad, who's the best civil rights attorney you know? Thomas smiled grimly. Gabrielle Washington. She doesn't lose, and she doesn't back down. The call connected immediately. Washington listened without interruption as Thomas outlined the situation. Her response was characteristically direct. Send me everything. Tomorrow, we build a case they can't ignore. As midnight approached, the family sat surrounded by evidence, video footage, medical documentation, complaint histories, statistical analysis, the foundation of a federal case. They'll fight back, Nicole warned. Hard. Let them, Flora said quietly. The girl who'd been silent in the nurse's office had found her voice. We have the truth, and we have each other. Thomas looked at his daughter, brilliant, wounded, determined, and felt pride mixed with heartbreak. She shouldn't have to fight this battle, but since she did, he'd make sure she had every weapon available. Then we don't pursue this through school channels. We go federal from day one. Civil rights complaint, lawsuit, media exposure, simultaneous pressure from multiple directions. The nuclear option, Nicole observed. The necessary option, Thomas corrected. They've left us no choice. Flora's phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize. I saw what happened. Officer Mitchell did something similar to me last year. Can we talk? She showed her parents. The first crack in the wall of silence. It's starting, Flora said. Other people are ready to speak. By morning, they had responses from 7 students willing to share their stories. By afternoon, 15. The coalition was forming before they'd even asked for one. Attorney Washington arrived at 6, briefcase full of legal precedents and strategy. She reviewed everything with an expert's eye, occasionally nodding or making notes. This is solid, better than solid. We have video evidence, medical documentation, pattern and practice across multiple victims, statistical proof of disparate treatment, and financial connections between district leadership and the private contractor. They buried complaints systematically, which shows consciousness of guilt. What's our first move? Thomas asked. We prepare for war, because that's what this will be. The counterattack began before dawn. Flora's phone buzzed with notifications, classmates forwarding messages from Principal Morgan announcing an emergency assembly about threats to staff safety and concerning student behavior patterns. At Richmond Preparatory Academy, students filed into the auditorium under Officer Mitchell's watchful gaze. He stood at attention, uniform pressed, badged gleaming, the picture of righteous authority. Principal Morgan took the podium. Recent events have reminded us that safety requires mutual respect between students and staff. When officers are forced to use appropriate restraint with students who physically refuse lawful instructions, it disrupts our learning environment. Flora sat in the back row, Jordan beside her. The message was clear without naming names. She was the problem, not the victim. That's gaslighting, textbook institutional gaslighting, Jordan whispered. By afternoon, Superintendent Crawford held a press conference. Local media attended dutifully, cameras rolling as he expressed the district's unwavering commitment to student safety and zero tolerance for false accusations against dedicated law enforcement personnel. The Richmond Times-Dispatch ran the story with careful neutrality that felt like complicity. School resource officers face growing challenges with increasingly defiant students. Flora discovered her college recommendation letters had been indefinitely delayed due to administrative review. Jordan's student newspaper faced sudden suspension for policy violations no one could specify. Marcus Williams received a summons to the principal's office regarding an unrelated minor incident from weeks ago. Clear intimidation. Flora Richardson found anonymous complaints filed with the Judicial Conduct Commission questioning whether his involvement in his daughter's case represented improper use of judicial influence. The implications were obvious: back down or face professional consequences. Nicole's nonprofit received notice that a major grant was under review due to concerns raised by community stakeholders. When she called the foundation, they were apologetic but firm. We have to consider all perspectives. At dinner, the Richardson family sat in heavy silence until Flora spoke. They're trying to isolate us, make everyone afraid to support us. It's working, Thomas admitted. 2 families who initially agreed to join the case have withdrawn. They're scared. Nicole's phone buzzed. She read the message, and her face hardened. Ethan Morris's parents just contacted me. They're forbidding him from associating with Flora. His father sits on the school board. Of course he does, Flora murmured. The pressure intensified daily. Coach Davis was reprimanded for inappropriate discussions after expressing support for Flora. Teachers who'd witnessed Mitchell's pattern of abuse suddenly remembered nothing. The machinery of institutional self-protection operated with practiced efficiency. Attorney Washington arrived that evening, her expression grim. I've received threatening messages, anonymous, but specific enough to be concerning. They know where my office is, where I live. Should we stop? Are we putting everyone at risk? Her parents in Washington exchanged glances. This was the goal of the counteroffensive, not to win legally, but to make the cost of fighting too high. No, Thomas said finally. We adapt. What do you mean? Nicole asked. Thomas looked at his daughter. Flora, what would happen if we appeared to surrender? Flora's eyes widened with understanding. They'd think they won, they'd get complacent. And while they're celebrating their victory, we build a case so comprehensive they can't escape it. A dangerous smile crossed Flora's face. Strategic retreat. Jordan leaned forward. Make them think the intimidation worked, while actually gathering more evidence? Exactly, Washington said, catching on. We appear to negotiate settlement while secretly expanding the investigation. It's risky, but it could work. Nicole nodded slowly. I can use my community networks quietly, identify other victims without drawing attention. I can get DOJ involved through back channels, former clerks, colleagues who won't leave fingerprints. And Jordan and I can create a secure platform for students to share experiences anonymously, Flora concluded. The counteroffensive had achieved something unexpected. It had forced them to think strategically rather than emotionally, to fight smarter rather than harder. Then we do this carefully, Washington said. Tomorrow, Judge Richardson, you request a meeting with school officials. Act exhausted, overwhelmed. Suggest you're open to resolution. Make them believe they've broken us, Nicole finished. Flora touched the healing wound above her eyebrow. While we're actually just getting started. Thomas Richardson sat across from Superintendent Crawford, Principal Morgan, and Secure Schools Inc.'s corporate counsel in the district administration building. He dressed carefully. Suit slightly rumpled, tie loosened, the picture of a weary father rather than a federal judge. I appreciate you meeting with me, Thomas began, allowing exhaustion to color his voice. This situation has taken a tremendous toll on my family. We understand, Judge Richardson. No one wants protracted conflict. We're prepared to offer reasonable resolution. The settlement terms were insulting. Flora's record expunged. Officer Mitchell receives additional training. Medical expenses covered. In exchange, non-disclosure agreement and withdrawal of all complaints. I need time to discuss this with my family. My wife, my daughter, they've been through so much. Of course, Morgan said quickly. Take all the time you need. Outside, Thomas texted one word to Nicole. Hooked. At school, Flora returned with visible defeat. She kept her head down, avoided confrontation, appeared thoroughly cowed. Officer Mitchell watched her with barely concealed satisfaction. Jordan removed their social media posts about the incident. Attorney Washington released a brief statement about exploring all options, including private resolution.
Nicole met quietly with families across Richmond, using her nonprofit's existing relationships to identify other victims. She listened to stories that made her blood boil. 15 separate accounts of Officer Mitchell's abuse, each dismissed or minimized by administration. Thomas reached out to former law clerks now working at the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. Careful conversations, no direct mentions of Flora's case, just hypothetical discussions about school-to-prison pipeline patterns. Flora and Jordan built an encrypted platform using secure servers and anonymous access protocols. Within days, students began sharing experiences, detailed accounts of discriminatory discipline, excessive force, and systematic targeting. The testimonies were devastating. Marcus Williams described his arrest for disorderly conduct that consisted of waiting for his mother at the mall. A sophomore detailed being handcuffed for talking back when she'd simply asked a question. A freshman recounted Mitchell grabbing him by the neck for walking too slowly. 47 testimonies in 2 weeks, each one documented, time-stamped, corroborated where possible. Detective Maria Rodriguez received the Mitchell case for internal affairs review, expecting routine clearance. Instead, she found complaint files that should have triggered investigations years ago. Financial records showing curious connections between district leadership and Secure Schools, Inc. Email chains discussing productivity targets for school resource officers. Rodriguez sat in her small office looking at photographs of her 2 teenage daughters. They attended public school. They could be next. She made a decision that would alter her career trajectory forever. Using an intermediary, she contacted Attorney Washington with an offer, off-the-record access to everything she'd found. Coach Davis provided years of documented complaints he'd filed about Mitchell, complaints that had disappeared into administrative black holes. His paper trail proved systematic cover-up. 3 weeks into the strategic retreat, the Richardson family gathered to review what they'd built. The dining table held evidence that transformed Flora's individual assault into proof of systematic civil rights violations. 63 student testimonies, Flora reported. Jordan's data analysis shows arrest patterns spike right before Secure Schools, Inc. contract renewals. Rodriguez found emails explicitly discussing performance metrics tied to arrest numbers. Crawford has consulting contracts with Secure Schools worth $150,000 annually. Thomas studied the financial forensics. This isn't just racist policing. It's a profit-driven school-to-prison pipeline with district leadership personally benefiting. Nicole reviewed the testimonies. These children were systematically criminalized to justify a detention facility expansion. They needed more arrests to prove the facility was necessary. And Mitchell delivered, Jordan concluded bitterly. "We're ready," Washington announced. "The question is timing." "We wait for them to make a mistake," Flora said. "They think they've won. Sooner or later, they'll get careless." Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Jordan's analytical mind identified patterns Rodriguez's investigation confirmed. Arrest rates spiked precisely when Secure Schools, Inc. contracts came up for renewal. Mitchell's productivity directly correlated with budget meetings where detention facility expansions were discussed. "It's a quota system," Jordan explained during a late-night coalition meeting in Reverend Patterson's church basement. "Mitchell arrests more students when the district needs to justify security spending." Marcus Williams shared his juvenile arrest record, voice shaking. "I was 15, honor roll student, no criminal history. Mitchell arrested me for disorderly conduct because I was waiting for my mom outside the mall. That arrest destroyed my GPA, cost me scholarship opportunities, follows me everywhere." His story resonated because it was Flora's story, and 85 other student stories. Individual incidents revealed as systematic oppression. Ethan Morris arrived late, looking shaken. "My father left his school board briefcase at home. I photographed everything." He produced his phone. Financial agreements between the district and Secure Schools, Inc. Email chains about targeting specific neighborhoods. It's all here. The room fell silent. Ethan, privileged white student from Richmond's wealthiest family, had risked everything to provide evidence from inside the power structure. "Why?" someone asked. "Because Flora is my friend. Because this is wrong. Because my family's wealth doesn't excuse complicity." Coach Davis stood. "I've documented incidents for 6 years.
Every time I reported Mitchell's behavior to administration, nothing happened. I have emails, written complaints, records of meetings where Morgan promised action that never came. Pattern and practice of deliberate indifference. Attorney Washington absorbed it all. Legal mind cataloging evidence. We have systematic targeting based on race, financial corruption connecting district leadership to private contractors, quota systems incentivizing excessive arrests, deliberate cover-up by administration. This isn't just civil rights violations, this could be RICO charges. Reverend Patterson, who'd organized coalition meetings while maintaining operational security, spoke with the authority of decades fighting institutional racism. The question isn't whether we have enough evidence. We do. The question is whether we're ready for what comes next. They will fight back viciously. Some of you will lose jobs, face financial hardship, endure threats. Are we prepared? Silence stretched. Then Flora stood. I'm 15 years old. I've been assaulted, gaslit, threatened, and watched the system try to destroy my family for seeking accountability. If I can stand up to that, anyone can. Her words catalyzed resolve. One by one, coalition members affirmed commitment, despite knowing the costs. Then we move forward, Washington declared. Coordinated action across multiple fronts simultaneously. They can't silence everyone at once. Rodriguez arrived through a back entrance, face obscured by hoodie. She provided Washington with encrypted drives containing the complete internal affairs file, financial records, and email chains. My career ends when this goes public, Rodriguez said quietly. But I have daughters. I can't let this continue. Thomas Richardson, who'd maintained careful distance to protect his judicial position, spoke last. I've spent my career believing institutions could reform from within. My daughter taught me that sometimes institutions must be reformed from without, by force if necessary. Whatever consequences come, they're worth it. The coalition had everything needed. Video evidence, medical documentation, 85 victim testimonies, financial forensics proving corruption, internal affairs files showing systematic cover-up, and insider witnesses from within the system itself. We're ready to strike, Washington concluded. 3 weeks to coordinate final details, then we expose everything simultaneously. But institutional power structures don't surrender easily. As the coalition prepared their offensive, Superintendent Crawford and Secure Schools, Inc. prepared their own devastating countermove, one that would test whether the coalition's commitment could withstand genuine danger. Reverend James Patterson's church had witnessed generations of struggle. The basement meeting room where civil rights activists had once planned boycotts and voter registration drives now hosted a different kind of resistance. 72 families filled the space. Black, white, Latino, spanning Richmond's economic spectrum. Teachers sat beside parents, students clustered in corners, some still wearing school uniforms. Detective Rodriguez stood near the exit, perpetually calculating escape routes.
Flora Richardson, barely visible among the crowd, felt the weight of expectation. She was 15 years old, yet somehow her assault had catalyzed this gathering. The responsibility felt crushing and empowering simultaneously. "Thank you all for coming," Reverend Patterson began, his voice carrying decades of moral authority. "We gather because our children deserve better than a system that profits from their criminalization." One by one, families shared stories. A mother described her son's arrest for loitering outside the library where he'd been studying. A father detailed how his daughter's suspension for defiance consisted of asking to use the bathroom. Each testimony added weight to the collective narrative. Marcus Williams stood, hands trembling. "Officer Mitchell arrested me last year for waiting for my mom. I had a 3.8 GPA. I'd never been in trouble. That arrest cost me scholarship opportunities, damaged my academic record, and gave me a criminal history for doing nothing wrong." His voice broke, but he continued. "I stayed silent because I was scared, and because my family couldn't afford to fight. But Flora's courage made me realize silence protects the system, not us." Applause rippled through the room. Flora caught Marcus's eye and nodded. Solidarity without words. Detective Rodriguez stepped forward reluctantly. "I'm risking my career being here." Internal Affairs discovered financial connections between Superintendent Crawford and Secure Schools, Inc., worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Email chains explicitly discuss targeting specific demographic neighborhoods to justify detention facility expansion. She projected documents on the wall. This isn't individual racism. It's systematic policy designed to criminalize Black and brown youth for profit. Gasps filled the room as people read Crawford's emails discussing productivity targets and demographic optimization strategies. Jordan presented their data analysis. Arrest rates spike precisely when Secure Schools, Inc. contracts come up for renewal. It's mathematically impossible for this to be coincidental. Ethan Morris approached the front, visibly nervous. As the only white student from Richmond Prep's wealthy donor families, his presence carried symbolic weight. "My father sits on the school board," Ethan said quietly. "I photographed documents from his briefcase showing financial agreements between district leadership and Secure Schools, Inc. I'm here because being complicit in injustice is worse than any social consequences I'll face." He distributed copies of his evidence, contracts, emails, financial statements proving the profit motive behind aggressive school policing. An older woman stood, anger evident. "My grandson was expelled on fabricated charges. We had no resources to fight. Are you saying this was deliberate?" "Yes," Attorney Washington replied bluntly. "Systematic, calculated, and designed to fill detention facilities that generate revenue." Tension filled the room. Some families wanted immediate action. Others, exhausted from years of harassment, questioned whether fighting was worth additional suffering. "They'll retaliate," a mother said. "I could lose my job. My family could lose our home." "They're already retaliating," Coach Davis countered. "I've been formally reprimanded for supporting students. They're forcing me into early retirement. But I'd rather lose my job than my integrity." Flora finally spoke, voice steady despite her youth. "I understand the fear. I'm living it. My family faces professional consequences, surveillance, and threats. But we have something they don't: the truth and each other. Alone, they can destroy us. Together, we're unstoppable." Reverend Patterson nodded approvingly. The civil rights movement succeeded through collective action. Individual complaints are dismissed, but coordinated pressure from multiple directions simultaneously creates change the system cannot suppress. Attorney Washington outlined their strategy. Federal civil rights lawsuit with multiple plaintiffs, simultaneous media exposure through various outlets, DOJ investigation, state education board complaints, and community organizing for school board recall. We strike from every direction at once: legal action, media pressure, governmental investigation, and grassroots organizing. They can't silence all of us simultaneously. Dr. Nicole Richardson facilitated breakout sessions where families processed trauma while strategizing action. Her clinical expertise helped people understand that their psychological responses to institutional betrayal were normal, not weakness. Hours passed as the coalition solidified. Families committed despite fear. Teachers pledged testimony despite career risks. Students agreed to speak publicly despite potential retaliation. Judge Thomas Richardson, carefully maintaining boundaries between his judicial role and personal advocacy, briefed everyone on legal protections and potential consequences. His presence signaled that even those with institutional power believed in their cause.
3 weeks, Washington announced. We finalize evidence, coordinate timing, and prepare for coordinated revelation. They'll fight back viciously. Some of you will face serious consequences, but we'll do it together. The meeting concluded with Reverend Patterson leading the group in an old civil rights anthem. Voices rose, filling the basement with defiant hope. As families departed, Flora approached Marcus Williams. Thank you for speaking. Thank you for going first, Marcus replied. Your courage made mine possible. Ethan joined them, looking uncertain about his reception. Flora extended her hand. Thank you. For the evidence. I know what it cost you. It's not enough, Ethan said quietly. My family's wealth came partly from systems that oppressed yours. I can't undo history, but I can refuse to continue it. Jordan documented everything: testimonies, evidence, coalition building. Their journalism was becoming the historical record of resistance. Coach Davis pulled Flora aside. You remind me why I became a teacher. Watching you transform trauma into advocacy gives me hope. I'm terrified, Flora admitted. Courage isn't absence of fear. It's acting despite it. As the Richardson family drove home, Nicole voiced what they were all thinking. We've built something powerful. But Principal Morgan and Crawford won't let this stand. They'll escalate. Let them, Thomas said grimly. We're ready. Flora stared out the window at Richmond streets. Gentrified neighborhoods built on displacement, wealth extracted from inequality, systems designed to maintain hierarchies. But she also saw possibility. Change didn't require perfection, just persistent pressure. 3 weeks. Then, everything changes. The coalition had formed, evidence was compiled, strategy was set, but institutional power, cornered and desperate, was preparing its own devastating response. Principal Victoria Morgan's mistake came from overconfidence. Believing the Richardson family had surrendered, she acted with impunity. Marcus Williams received notice of expulsion based on fabricated accusations of threatening behavior. The charges were absurd. Marcus had never been violent, but Morgan assumed no one would challenge her anymore. She miscalculated catastrophically. Attorney Washington's phone rang at 6 in the morning. Marcus's mother, voice breaking, explained the expulsion. Attorney Washington made 3 calls to Judge Richardson, Detective Rodriguez, and Reverend Patterson. The message was identical. They just accelerated our timeline. We move today. By noon, the coordinated strike began. Washington filed a comprehensive federal civil rights lawsuit in the Eastern District of Virginia. The complaint named Officer Brandon Mitchell, Principal Victoria Morgan, Superintendent Robert Crawford, Secure Schools, Inc., and the Richmond School District as defendants. 85 plaintiffs, students systematically targeted, criminalized, and denied constitutional protections. The complaint detailed financial corruption, racial targeting, deliberate criminalization of youth for profit, quota systems incentivizing arrests, and systematic cover-up by administration. Supporting documentation filled 3 bankers' boxes: video evidence, medical records, internal affairs files, financial forensics, and 85 sworn testimonies. Simultaneously, Jordan's investigative report published online. They'd partnered with ProPublica, The Washington Post, and local outlets simultaneously to prevent suppression. The multimedia expose combined Flora's assault video, student testimonies, Rodriguez's internal affairs findings, financial records showing Crawford's conflict of interest, and data analysis proving systematic racial targeting. The headline was devastating. Richmond schools criminalize black youth for profit. How one district's corruption created a school-to-prison pipeline. Within hours, the story went viral. National media picked it up. Civil rights organizations amplified it. Social media exploded with outrage. Detective Rodriguez, knowing her career was ending regardless, submitted her complete internal affairs report simultaneously to the police commissioner, FBI, state attorney general, and DOJ's Civil Rights Division. She'd encrypted copies and distributed them widely enough that burial was impossible. Her cover letter was brief. I cannot remain silent while children are systematically abused for profit. Attached is evidence of corruption, civil rights violations, and criminal conspiracy. I expect retaliation, but my conscience requires action. Reverend Patterson's press conference at noon drew massive attendance. 15 families stood before cameras telling their stories.
The visual was powerful. Diverse families united against institutional oppression. "Our children are not commodities," Reverend Patterson declared. Richmond School District has treated them as revenue streams for private contractors. Today, we demand accountability.
Parents spoke through tears. Students described trauma. The human cost of systematic criminalization became undeniable. Coach Davis and 12 other teachers filed formal complaints with State Education Board, detailing administrative retaliation for protecting students. Their collective testimony proved that teachers who challenged the system faced career destruction. Ethan Morris delivered his photographed evidence to school board members, forcing an emergency session. His father, David Morris, attempted damage control, but the documentation was irrefutable. By afternoon, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, which Judge Richardson had quietly briefed weeks earlier, announced a formal pattern or practice investigation into Richmond school discipline policies. The statement emphasized systematic civil rights violations affecting minority students. Local news anchors struggled to maintain neutrality. The evidence was overwhelming. Flora's assault video played repeatedly, each viewing sparking fresh outrage. Crawford's emails discussing demographic targeting made even conservative commentators uncomfortable. Superintendent Crawford issued a defensive statement denying all wrongdoing, but his credibility was destroyed by financial records showing personal profit from contracts with Secure Schools, Inc. Officer Mitchell was placed on administrative leave. Secure Schools, Inc. suspended his employment pending investigation. His police union representative held a press conference defending him, but the video evidence made defense impossible. Principal Morgan went into hiding, refusing media contact. Her career-long compromise of student safety for institutional protection had finally caught up. By evening, Richmond City Council called emergency hearings on school district oversight. State legislators demanded investigations. The governor issued a statement expressing concern and promising accountability. Flora watched the news coverage from her living room, surrounded by family. Seeing her assault video broadcast nationally was re-traumatizing, but necessary. Personal violation became catalyst for systemic change. "How are you holding up?" Nicole asked gently. "I'm okay," Flora replied. "This needed to happen." Thomas's phone rang constantly. Journalists, colleagues, civil rights organizations. The legal and political establishment couldn't ignore coordinated revelation from multiple authoritative sources. Jordan's journalism won immediate recognition. Their reporting combined rigorous data analysis with compelling narrative, making complex, systematic racism comprehensible to general audiences. Marcus Williams, whose expulsion triggered the accelerated timeline, watched the news in disbelief. "This is really happening." "Because of you," Flora texted him. "Your courage to share your story made this possible." At Secure Schools, Inc.'s headquarters, executives convened crisis meetings. Their business model, profiting from school policing contracts inflated through excessive criminalization, was being exposed nationally. Stock prices plummeted. Other districts began reviewing contracts. Superintendent Crawford, cornered by evidence and abandoned by allies, hired expensive lawyers. But no amount of legal skill could overcome video evidence, internal affairs files, and financial records proving corruption. As night fell, Richmond was transformed. What had seemed like isolated incidents was revealed as calculated, systematic oppression. The coordinated strike had succeeded beyond expectations. Truth suppressed for years exploded into public consciousness simultaneously from too many sources to silence. But institutional power, facing existential threat, was preparing its most vicious counterattack yet. When systems of oppression are cornered, they become most dangerous. Secure Schools, Inc.'s response was swift and brutal.
Within 24 hours, they filed $50 million defamation lawsuits against Jordan Parker and Attorney Washington. The goal wasn't winning. It was financial destruction through litigation costs. Jordan's mother received termination notice from her employer, a company whose CEO sat on Secure Schools, Inc.'s board. 20 years of employment ended with 2 weeks of severance and transparent retaliation. "I'm so sorry," Jordan said, voice breaking. "You lost your job because of my reporting." Their mother pulled Jordan close. "You exposed truth. I'm proud of you. We'll figure out the rest." But financial pressure was crushing. Jordan's college savings might need to cover legal defense. Their family's stability crumbled because Jordan had documented injustice. Detective Rodriguez was suspended from duty pending investigation into unauthorized disclosure of confidential internal affairs information. The charges were technically accurate, but selectively applied. White officers leaked information regularly, without consequence. Rodriguez's captain delivered the suspension notice with visible discomfort. "You know this was coming, Maria. You went over everyone's heads."
Children were being abused for profit, Rodriguez replied steadily. I'd make the same choice again. But her suspension meant no paycheck, no health insurance, and potential criminal charges. Her daughters watched their mother face career destruction for doing what was right. Marcus Williams' family faced eviction. Their landlord, claiming lease violations that hadn't existed before, filed eviction proceedings. The landlord's brother-in-law worked for the school district. The connection was obvious, the message clear. Speak against the system, lose your home. Flora discovered surveillance had intensified. Unmarked vehicles followed her to school. Strange clicking on phone calls suggested monitoring. Most frightening was the anonymous message describing her daily routine with chilling accuracy. You leave home at 7:15. Take the bus at 7:22. Arrive at school at 7:48. Think carefully about continuing this path. The Richardson family held an emergency meeting. Thomas's FBI contacts confirmed their communications were likely monitored, their movements tracked. The threats weren't idle, they were systematic intimidation. "We can stop," Thomas said carefully. "We've exposed the corruption. Others can continue the fight." Flora shook her head. "If we stop now, everyone else becomes more vulnerable. They're targeting us because we have resources to resist. Families without our advantages will be destroyed." Nicole agreed. Backing down now would be abandoning everyone who joined this coalition, trusting we'd see it through. But the costs kept mounting. Nicole's nonprofit lost major funding as donors faced pressure from politically connected board members. Grants were canceled. Programs serving traumatized youth faced closure. Superintendent Crawford, cornered and desperate, released confidential student records. A clear FERPA violation, but effective character assassination. Marcus Williams's juvenile record became public. Other plaintiffs' disciplinary histories were leaked, decontextualized to portray them as troublemakers. Local media outlets with financial ties to the school district ran balanced coverage questioning the accusations. Op-eds appeared suggesting the lawsuit was driven by opportunism rather than justice. Comment sections filled with racist vitriol attacking the families. Attorney Washington's office was vandalized. Racist graffiti covered the walls. Windows were smashed. Files were scattered, but nothing stolen. The message was intimidation, not theft. Coach Davis received termination notice. Despite tenure and exemplary record, administration found pretexts to fire him. His willingness to document abuse and support students had marked him for destruction. The coalition meeting that week was contentious. Several families, overwhelmed by retaliation, wanted to withdraw from the lawsuit. Economic pressure was working. People couldn't afford justice when it cost their livelihoods. "I can't lose my home," one mother said desperately. "I have 3 children. Fighting this system is destroying my family." "That's exactly what they're counting on," Reverend Patterson replied gently.
They make the cost of justice higher than people can bear. But moral arguments didn't pay rent or replace lost jobs. The coalition was fracturing under sustained assault. Flora felt crushing guilt. Her assault had catalyzed this, and now families were suffering consequences they couldn't afford. She stood before the group, voice steady despite internal turmoil. "I understand if you need to withdraw. No one should judge you for protecting your families. But please understand, if we all retreat individually, they win permanently. If we stand together, we can endure what would destroy us separately." An older woman stood. "My grandson was expelled on false charges 2 years ago. I stayed silent because I was scared. I'm done being scared. Whatever they do to me, I'm staying." Others murmured agreement, but several families quietly left and the meeting ended. The coalition was smaller. That night, Flora received a message that made her blood run cold. Detailed information about her younger twin siblings' school schedules, their walking routes, the playground where they played after school. Thomas immediately contacted FBI Protective Services. Threatening a federal judge's family crossed lines that triggered federal resources. But the message was clear. They'd escalate to threatening children if necessary. Nicole held Flora as she finally broke down, tears coming after weeks of maintaining composure. "I never wanted anyone else to suffer because of what happened to me." "This isn't your fault," Nicole said firmly. "Systematic oppression survives by making victims feel responsible for the consequences of exposing it."
Attorney Washington arrived with news that complicated everything. Secure Schools, Inc. has hired forensic investigators to dig into every plaintiff's background. They're looking for anything to discredit people: financial problems, past legal issues, anything exploitable. "Can we protect everyone?" Thomas asked. "Not fully," Washington admitted. "Some people will face revelations they'd rather keep private. The question is whether the coalition can withstand having every vulnerability exposed." Detective Rodriguez, despite suspension, continued investigating. She'd found evidence that the threats against witnesses were coordinated to a crisis management firm hired by Secure Schools, Inc. The documentation showed a playbook for destroying opposition through targeted harassment. "They've done this before," Rodriguez explained. "In 3 other cities where their contracts were challenged, they systematically destroyed whistleblowers through legal, financial, and reputational attacks, every time the opposition eventually collapsed." "So what do we do?" Jordan asked. "We document everything," Rodriguez replied. "Every threat, every retaliatory action, every coordinated attack, because witness intimidation is a federal crime, and they're creating evidence of conspiracy with each action they take." Flora looked at the coalition, smaller now, exhausted, facing threats that felt overwhelming, but still fighting. "They're trying to break us because we're winning," she said quietly. "Systems don't fight this hard against threats they can ignore. Our pain is proof we're dangerous to them." The room absorbed her words. The counterattack was brutal precisely because the coordinated strike had been effective. Institutional power was fighting for survival. But the question remained, could the coalition endure long enough for justice to prevail, or would systematic retaliation achieve what legal defense could not? Silence through suffering. As the meeting ended, Flora noticed Thomas on his phone, face grim. When he hung up, his expression was haunted. "What is it?" Nicole asked. "The Judicial Conduct Commission has opened a formal investigation into whether I've abused my position. If they find against me, I could be removed from the bench." The stakes had reached their highest point. The system was prepared to destroy everyone: students, families, teachers, attorneys, even a federal judge, rather than accept accountability. The coalition faced its darkest moment, unsure whether courage alone could overcome coordinated institutional power determined to protect itself at any cost. The breaking point came from an unexpected source. David Morris sat in his home office at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep. His son Ethan hadn't spoken to him in days. His wife blamed him for their social ostracization. School board colleagues avoided his calls, all because Ethan had photographed documents from his briefcase and joined Flora Richardson's coalition. David had spent decades building wealth and influence through careful networking and strategic investments. His position on the school board brought prestige and access. Secure Schools, Inc. contracts seemed like smart fiscal policy.
Private contractors were more efficient than unionized public employees, or so he'd told himself. But watching his 15-year-old son choose principle over privilege had shattered David's comfortable rationalizations. Ethan had sacrificed social standing, parental approval, and inherited advantages because he believed criminalizing black youth for profit was wrong. David opened his home safe and removed files he'd kept as insurance, complete documentation of the financial arrangements between district leadership and Secure Schools, Inc. Email chains explicitly discussing targeting certain demographic populations to justify detention facility expansion. Contracts showing how increased arrest quotas generated bonuses for administrators. Plans to expand the juvenile detention system based on projected arrest rates in specific neighborhoods. The documents proved intentional racial discrimination as district policy, not individual prejudice. At dawn, David called Attorney Washington. "I need to speak with you. I have evidence." 2 hours later, Washington sat in her office reviewing documents that transformed the entire case. David Morris, establishment insider with everything to lose, was providing irrefutable proof of systematic conspiracy. "Why now?" Washington asked. "Because my son showed more courage at 15 than I've shown in 53 years, David replied quietly. "Because I've been complicit in criminalizing children for profit. Because I can't live with myself if I don't try to make this right. You understand this destroys your reputation, your position, potentially your marriage? I understand that some things matter more than comfort." David's voice was steady. "My son taught me that."
Washington called Judge Richardson immediately. "We have everything." Morris's documentation combined with the threats against witnesses transforms this from civil rights violations to potential RICO charges. Conspiracy, fraud, witness intimidation, all conducted under color of law. Thomas Richardson felt something he hadn't allowed himself: hope. Can you protect the families who've been targeted? The FBI investigation that started to protect your family has expanded. They're treating the witness intimidation as federal crimes. The threats actually strengthened our case by proving conspiracy and consciousness of guilt. Events moved rapidly. The FBI arrested Superintendent Robert Crawford at his home on federal corruption charges. The perp walk made national news. A district superintendent in handcuffs, accused of profiting from systematically criminalizing black youth. Officer Brandon Mitchell was charged criminally with assault, civil rights violations, and conspiracy. Without his uniform and badge, he looked diminished, just a man who'd abused power and thought he'd never face consequences. Principal Victoria Morgan, faced with overwhelming evidence and potential prison time, agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Her testimony detailed how district leadership had explicitly instructed her to support aggressive policing in specific neighborhoods, bury complaints, and protect Secure Schools, Inc. contracts at all costs. Secure Schools, Inc. faced federal investigations in 7 states. Their stock price collapsed. School districts nationwide began reviewing and terminating contracts. The business model, profiting from school policing inflated through excessive criminalization, was exposed and unsustainable. Most importantly, the documentation of threats against witnesses led to arrests. The crisis management firm hired by Secure Schools, Inc. to intimidate families had created paper trails proving conspiracy. Jordan's mother was offered her job back with back pay and a settlement. Marcus Williams' family received housing assistance and the eviction was dismissed. Detective Rodriguez was reinstated with commendation for integrity. National media coverage shifted dramatically. David Morris's testimony, a wealthy white establishment figure confirming everything the coalition had alleged, made denial impossible. When insider witnesses validate outside critics, the narrative shifts. Major outlets ran extended features on the school-to-prison pipeline, using Richmond as a case study. Flora's assault video became emblematic of broader systematic issues. The story transcended local controversy to spark national conversation about school policing, private contractors in public education, and racial justice. 6 months later, Richmond had transformed. Special elections replaced half the school board. New members prioritized students over profits, accountability over image management.
Their first action was terminating Secure Schools Inc.'s contract and implementing restorative justice approaches. The new superintendent, hired after a national search, had a background in educational equity rather than corporate management. Her first district-wide assembly addressed systematic racism directly, acknowledging decades of harm and committing to repair. Marcus Williams stood before the school board as they formally expunged his juvenile record and issued a public apology. What happened to Marcus Williams was not an isolated mistake, but systematic policy, the board chair announced. We failed him and countless others. Today begins the process of making amends. Marcus received a full scholarship to Virginia Commonwealth University and support services to help him pursue deferred dreams. His story became a model for how restorative justice could partially repair systematic harm. Jordan Parker's journalism won the National Student Press Association's highest honor. Their reporting had combined rigorous data analysis with compelling narrative to expose corruption and catalyze change. Georgetown University's journalism program offered a full scholarship. Detective Maria Rodriguez was promoted to sergeant and assigned to develop community policing initiatives. Her integrity had been vindicated, and her career flourished because she'd chosen conscience over convenience. Coach Anthony Davis became the district's first equity and inclusion coordinator, overseeing discipline reform and teacher training on implicit bias and restorative practices. Attorney Gabrielle Washington's successful litigation against Richmond School District established legal precedents used in similar cases nationwide. Her practice expanded, handling school-to-prison pipeline cases across multiple states. Ethan Morris and his father slowly rebuilt their relationship. David's testimony had cost him his school board position and some social connections, but gained him his son's respect. Their journey demonstrated that even beneficiaries of unjust systems could choose transformation over complicity. 8 months after the assault, Flora Richardson stood before the Virginia General Assembly's Education Committee. At 16, she was the youngest person to testify on proposed school policing reform legislation.
I was 15 years old when Officer Mitchell assaulted me in my school hallway, Flora began, voice steady and clear. But my story isn't unique, it's representative. Across Virginia and nationwide, students are criminalized for normal adolescent behavior when they're black or brown, while white students face minimal consequences for identical actions. She presented data Jordan had compiled, showing statewide disparities. This isn't about individual prejudice. It's systematic policy that treats certain children as threats to be controlled, rather than young people to be nurtured. Flora's testimony was powerful because it combined personal narrative with policy analysis, emotional resonance with empirical evidence. She spoke not just as victim, but as advocate, not just for herself, but for all students trapped in criminalization systems. The question isn't whether we can afford reform, it's whether we can afford to continue destroying children's futures for profit. My family had resources to fight back. Most don't. Justice shouldn't require privilege. The committee listened with unusual attention. Several members wiped tears. When Flora finished, sustained applause filled the chamber, unprecedented for legislative testimony. The bill passed overwhelmingly, establishing statewide oversight of school policing, banning arrest quotas, requiring de-escalation training, and creating accountability mechanisms for excessive force. Governor Eleanor Hayes signed the legislation with Flora standing beside her. This young woman's courage transformed personal trauma into systemic change, the governor announced. Her advocacy will protect countless students who would have suffered in silence. 1 year after the assault, Richmond's data showed measurable change. School-based arrests had decreased 73%. Racial disparities in discipline, while not eliminated, had narrowed significantly. Students reported feeling safer with security personnel focused on protection rather than criminalization. The transformation wasn't complete. Systematic racism couldn't be dismantled in a year, but direction had shifted. Policies prioritized student well-being over contractor profits.
Accountability replaced impunity. Transparency replaced cover-ups. Flora spoke at a national conference on educational equity in Washington, D.C. The ballroom held hundreds of educators, policymakers, advocates, and students from across the country. Her presence on the main stage, a 16-year-old black girl who'd been assaulted in her school hallway, symbolized how victims could become change-makers. A year ago, I was silent, not because I accepted what happened, but because I was processing how power operates. I learned that silence can be strategic, but ultimately, voice is power. She described the journey from assault to advocacy, from isolation to coalition building, from victim to architect of systemic change. Justice required both strategic patience and bold action. We gathered evidence methodically. We built coalitions across differences. We coordinated revelations from multiple sources simultaneously. We endured retaliation that would have broken us individually, but that we survived collectively. She acknowledged the costs. People lost jobs, families faced threats, careers were damaged. The price of challenging systematic oppression is real and high. But the cost of silence is higher. It's paid by every student who suffers while we look away. She spoke about privilege and obligation. I had advantages most don't. Educated parents, resources, a father whose position provided some protection. Those advantages didn't prevent my assault, but they enabled my response. That creates obligation. If I can fight, I must. Not just for myself, but for students without such advantages. The audience included Marcus Williams, Jordan Parker, Detective Rodriguez, Coach Davis, Attorney Washington, Reverend Patterson, and Ethan Morris. The coalition that had fought together sat together, their collective presence testament to the power of organized resistance. Flora's parents sat in the front row, pride evident on their faces. Thomas Richardson had questioned whether institutional reform was possible. His daughter had proven that institutions don't reform voluntarily. They transform when forced by organized pressure they can't suppress. Nicole Richardson had spent her career treating trauma. She'd learned that healing required both individual therapy and systemic change. Her daughter embodied that integration, transforming personal violation into collective liberation. The Richmond Coalition's model is spreading. 3 cities have adapted our strategies. Coordinated revelation from multiple sources, coalition building across differences, documentation that makes denial impossible, legal action combined with grassroots organizing. She projected images, student activists in Detroit, parents organizing in Atlanta, teachers speaking truth in Phoenix. The movement was metastasizing, each victory inspiring others. Systematic change is measured not in perfect resolution, but in transformed dynamics. Richmond still has work to do. Racial disparities persist, but power relations have shifted. Students have voice. Accountability exists. Transparency is expected. That's progress worth celebrating while recognizing distance remaining.
Flora's conclusion emphasized intergenerational continuity. Reverend Patterson, who marched with John Lewis, taught us that civil rights struggles continue across generations. The tactics evolve. We use digital organizing tools our predecessors lacked, but the core principles remain. Collective action, strategic thinking, moral courage, and refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. She ended where she began, acknowledging her journey from silent victim to vocal advocate. The scar above my eyebrow reminds me daily where this started, but it doesn't define me. I'm not just the girl who was assaulted. I'm the advocate who transformed violation into systemic change, and that work continues. Standing ovation filled the ballroom. Flora stood quietly, absorbing the moment. A year ago, she'd sat in a nurse's office with blood on her shirt, processing betrayal by institutions meant to protect her. Today, she stood on a national stage, having helped dismantle the machinery of that oppression. After the conference, Flora found a quiet corner and checked her phone. A message from a student in Baltimore read, "I was assaulted by my school resource officer last week. I saw your speech.
Can you help me understand how to fight back? Flora felt the weight of responsibility and possibility simultaneously. Her story had become template for others facing similar oppression. That was burden and blessing. Burden because each message represented trauma. Blessing because each represented potential for transformation. She responded, "You're not alone. Document everything. Find allies, build coalitions. Justice is possible, but it requires strategy, patience, and collective action. I'll connect you with resources." Thomas Richardson found his daughter and pulled her into a hug. "I'm so proud of you. You've accomplished more at 16 than most do in lifetimes." "We accomplished it together," Flora corrected. "None of this was individual achievement." Nicole joined them. "What's next for you?" Flora smiled. "College applications, finishing high school, continuing advocacy work. The Richmond Coalition is establishing a nonprofit to support students fighting similar battles nationwide. Jordan and I are developing a digital platform for documenting and challenging school-based discrimination." "And personally?" Nicole asked gently, the therapist in her monitoring her daughter's well-being. "I'm healing," Flora replied honestly. "The trauma is real. I have nightmares sometimes. Certain sounds trigger anxiety, but I'm working through it with your help. And I've learned that trauma can coexist with purpose, that healing doesn't require forgetting, that scars can be evidence of survival rather than defeat." Judge Richardson looked at his daughter, brilliant, wounded, resilient, and transformative, and felt complex emotions. Pride in her courage, grief that she'd been forced to fight battles she shouldn't have faced, hope that her generation might finally dismantle systems his generation had merely managed. "You've changed me," Thomas admitted. "I spent my career believing institutions could reform from within through patient, incremental pressure. You proved that sometimes institutions require forcible transformation from the outside. Both approaches matter, but I'd prioritized patience over urgency. You taught me that justice delayed is often justice denied, especially for those without power to wait." Flora hugged her father. "You taught me strategy, evidence gathering, understanding power dynamics, and thinking several moves ahead. Mom taught me empathy, community organizing, and that systemic change requires addressing both policy and trauma. I combined your lessons with my generation's tools and perspective. That's intergenerational progress." Across Richmond, the impact of the coalition's victory continued rippling outward. Marcus Williams walked across Virginia Commonwealth University's campus, officially enrolled with full scholarship. His expulsion had been expunged, his juvenile record was cleared, his future, once derailed by one racist officer, was back on track. He'd declared a major in social work, wanting to support youth trapped in systems that had nearly destroyed him. Jordan Parker worked at the Washington Post's Richmond Bureau. Their student journalism had launched a career in investigative reporting focused on systematic injustice. Their mother had found better employment, and their family's financial stability had been restored. Detective Rodriguez trained new officers in community policing. Her integrity had transformed her from potential scapegoat to departmental model. Her daughters watched their mother with pride, learning that doing right sometimes requires sacrifice, but ultimately prevails. Coach Davis worked with teachers across the district, helping them understand implicit bias and restorative approaches to discipline. His termination had been rescinded with back pay and promotion. Students who once feared excessive discipline now felt supported by adults committed to their development. Ethan Morris volunteered with the coalition's nonprofit, using his privilege and insider knowledge to support families fighting similar battles. His relationship with his father remained complicated. David's late conversion couldn't erase years of complicity, but they were building something authentic based on shared commitment to justice rather than inherited advantage.
Reverend Patterson watched the younger generation with satisfaction. He'd marched in the 60s believing justice would arrive in his lifetime. It hadn't, but each generation moved the work forward. Flora's coalition had adapted civil rights movement strategies to contemporary challenges, proving that the struggle continued, but so did progress. Attorney Washington's practice thrived. Her successful litigation against Richmond had established her as the go-to attorney for school-to-prison pipeline cases nationwide. She was selective about clients, prioritizing those with strong evidence and commitment to systemic change over individual settlements. Each case was an opportunity to establish precedents that protected students beyond immediate plaintiffs. 2 years after the assault, Flora Richardson graduated from Richmond Preparatory Academy as valedictorian. Her commencement speech addressed the school's transformation directly. 2 years ago, I was assaulted in these hallways by an officer who saw students as threats rather than young people with potential. Today, I graduate from a school that's chosen transformation over defensiveness, accountability over reputation management, and students over profits. She acknowledged ongoing work. Change is incomplete. Disparities persist, but direction matters. Richmond Prep has begun reimagining what education can be when it prioritizes student well-being over systems of control. Flora's speech resonated because it avoided both cynical despair and naive optimism. It acknowledged harm while celebrating progress, recognized distance remaining while validating distance traveled. As Flora accepted her diploma, the auditorium erupted in applause. This young woman, assaulted, traumatized but unbowed, had transformed institutional violence into systematic change. Her graduation represented not just academic achievement, but moral victory. That fall, Flora enrolled at Howard University, her father's alma mater, majoring in political science with plans for law school. She wanted to become a civil rights attorney, continuing the work Attorney Washington had modeled. But Flora's advocacy didn't pause for college. She co-founded the National Student Coalition Against School Criminalization, a network connecting student activists fighting school-to-prison pipelines nationwide. The organization provided resources, strategic support, and solidarity for students challenging oppressive systems. The coalition's model, coordinated revelation from multiple sources, evidence-based advocacy, coalition building across differences, and combining legal action with grassroots organizing, was being replicated in cities across America. Flora mentored younger activists, passing forward lessons she learned through painful experience. She taught them about strategic patience and bold action, about gathering evidence that makes denial impossible, about building coalitions that make retaliation ineffective, and about transforming personal trauma into collective liberation. Each mentoring conversation reminded Flora why the work mattered. Behind every statistic was a student whose future hung in the balance. Behind every policy was a young person criminalized for being young. Behind every reform was countless children who would be protected from harm she'd experienced. 5 years after the assault, Flora Richardson, now a third-year law student at Yale, returned to Richmond for the dedication of the Flora Richardson Student Justice Center. The facility, funded by the settlement from the lawsuit against Secure Schools, Inc., provided legal support, counseling, and advocacy training for students facing discriminatory discipline. At the dedication ceremony, Richmond's mayor acknowledged the city's past while celebrating its transformation. 5 years ago, Flora Richardson was assaulted in a school hallway, and our community's first instinct was to protect institutions rather than students. Today, we dedicate this center as a commitment that students will always have resources to challenge injustice. Flora stood beside Attorney Washington, Detective Rodriguez, Coach Davis, Jordan Parker, Marcus Williams, and Ethan Morris, the coalition that had fought together, now celebrating collective victory. This center exists because one person's courage became many people's movement, Reverend Patterson said in blessing the facility. Flora Richardson's journey from silent victim to vocal advocate catalyzed transformation that protects students who will never know her name but will benefit from her courage. Flora spoke last, her words reflecting maturity earned through struggle. This center represents what's possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. But it also reminds us that justice required enormous sacrifice. People lost jobs, faced threats, endured trauma.
We honor them by continuing the work. She looked at the young people in attendance, students who would use this center's resources, who would fight their own battles against systematic oppression. You inherit both our victories and our unfinished work. The school-to-prison pipeline persists in new forms. Systematic racism adapts when challenged but doesn't disappear. Your generation must continue the fight with new strategies and renewed commitment.
Flora's final words echoed her testimony before the Virginia legislature years earlier. Justice shouldn't require privilege. Change shouldn't demand suffering. But until we build truly equitable systems, we must support those brave enough to challenge injustice despite costs. This center is that support made tangible. Flora Richardson's story didn't end with perfect resolution, because systemic change is ongoing, not complete. Richmond's schools were better, but not perfect. Racial disparities were reduced, but not eliminated. The school-to-prison pipeline was disrupted, but not destroyed. But that incomplete victory mattered. Thousands of students avoided criminalization because of reforms Flora's coalition achieved. Policies in 17 states changed because of precedents established in Richmond. Movements in 32 cities adapted strategies the coalition had pioneered. Individual courage had catalyzed collective power. Personal trauma had been transformed into systemic change. One girl's assault had exposed corruption affecting thousands, and the exposure had forced accountability that protected countless others. Flora carried the scar above her eyebrow as permanent reminder of where the journey began. But she was no longer defined by that violation. She was the advocate who'd transformed it into liberation, the strategist who'd organized victory, the mentor passing lessons forward to the next generation of resistance. The work continued because systematic oppression persists across generations. But so does resistance. And Flora Richardson, once silent in a nurse's office processing betrayal, had found her voice and used it to amplify thousands more. That was justice reimagined, not perfect, not complete, but real. Not individual revenge, but collective transformation. Not just punishment for wrongdoing, but reconstruction of systems that enabled it. Flora Richardson's journey from victim to advocate proved that courage could be contagious, that truth could overcome institutional denial, that organized people could force change powerful interests resisted, and that even those born into oppressive systems could help dismantle them. The fight continued, but Flora Richardson had shown how to wage it effectively. Her legacy was not just Richmond's transformation, but a model for how systematic change happens. Through strategic thinking, collective action, moral courage, and unwavering commitment to justice, even when the cost is high, especially when the stakes are everything.